I never thought I'd be standing on a sidewalk at 72 years old, holding a suitcase that contained what was left of my life, watching my own son close the door on me like I was a stranger asking for spare change. But there I was, feeling the weight of every sacrifice I'd ever made crushing down on my shoulders like stones. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. I'd woken up in the small bedroom that used to be David's when he was little, the one he'd grudgingly let me keep when he moved back into my house after his divorce. Temporarily, he'd said 3 years ago, just until I get back on my feet. I should have known then that temporary had a different meaning when it came from the mouth of a 38-year-old man who'd learned to take everything for granted. I'd made his coffee the way he liked it, 2 sugars, splash of cream, just like I'd been doing every morning since he was tall enough to reach the counter. The same counter where I'd helped him with homework while working double shifts at the motel, where I'd packed his lunches with hands that ached from scrubbing other people's floors, where I'd counted and recounted grocery money to make sure there was enough for his school supplies. He was sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with that distant expression he'd perfected over the years, the one that made me feel invisible even when I was standing right in front of him. His breakfast sat untouched, scrambled eggs the way his father used to make them, though David had been too young to remember that. I'd kept making them that way anyway, holding on to the good memories from a marriage that had been anything but good. "David, honey," I'd said, setting his coffee down carefully beside his plate. "I was thinking, maybe for my birthday next week we could—" "Mom." The word came out like a sigh, heavy with the kind of exhaustion that suggested my very existence was burdensome. He didn't even look up from his phone. "We've talked about this, but we hadn't talked about anything. That was the problem. For months, maybe years, every conversation had been me speaking to the top of his head while he stared at that glowing screen, giving me the same distracted responses he might give to a telemarketer. I tried again, my voice smaller this time. "I just thought, since it's my 72nd birthday, maybe we could have dinner together. Nothing fancy. I could cook that pot roast you used to love when you were—" "When I was a kid," he interrupted, finally looking at me with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the woman who'd raised him alone after his father walked out. "I'm not a kid anymore, Mom, and frankly, neither are you. It's time you started acting like it." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept standing there, coffee pot still in my hand, trying to understand when exactly my son had started speaking to me like I was an inconvenience, rather than the woman who'd given up everything to make sure he had a future. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd raised David by myself from the time he was 6 years old, when his father decided that responsibility wasn't for him and disappeared into whatever life he thought he deserved. I was 29 then, working 2 jobs and going to night school, believing that education and hard work would eventually pay off for both of us. I dropped out of college when David got sick with pneumonia and needed constant care. I never went back. The cleaning job at Riverside Hospital paid better than most, but it meant working nights when David needed help with homework, missing school plays when he needed someone to cheer for him, showing up to parent-teacher conferences with bleach-stained hands and exhaustion written across my face. I told myself it was temporary, that once David graduated and found his footing, I could think about my own dreams again. I'd worked at that hospital for 38 years, watching other people's children grow up in the hallways while mine grew up in the empty spaces between my shifts. I cleaned the rooms where families celebrated new births and mourned final breaths, where love was expressed in whispered conversations and gentle touches. I learned what mattered by watching other people hold on to it. When David graduated high school, I was so proud I cried right there in the auditorium, surrounded by families who had 2 parents and stable incomes and college funds that didn't require choosing between textbooks and groceries. My boy had made it despite everything, despite his father's absence, despite our cramped apartment, despite wearing thrift store clothes and carrying lunch in brown paper bags while other kids had insulated lunchboxes with cartoon characters. He'd gotten into a decent state school with partial scholarships that I'd helped him apply for, staying up late at our kitchen table while he filled out forms and wrote essays. I'd taken on extra shifts to cover what the scholarships didn't, telling myself that this sacrifice would be the last one, that once David had his degree, everything would change for both of us. But when he graduated, instead of the gratitude I'd quietly hoped for, I got lectures about how I needed to modernize my life, how I was stuck in the past, how my simple ways embarrassed him in front of the girlfriend he'd met in college. She was a sweet girl from a family with money, and I could see in her eyes that she was trying to understand why David seemed almost ashamed of the woman who'd made his education possible. The girlfriend didn't last, and neither did the job he'd found right out of college, or the second job, or the third. Each failure was accompanied by explanations about workplace politics and unfair bosses and bad timing. Never any acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the work ethic I'd tried to teach him hadn't quite taken root. When his marriage ended after 5 years, he'd moved back into my house, the small 2-bedroom home I'd finally been able to buy after decades of renting, the place where I'd imagined spending my retirement reading books and tending a garden, and maybe, if I was lucky, spoiling grandchildren who would visit on weekends. Those grandchildren never came. David's ex-wife had made it clear that children weren't in their plans, at least not with him. I'd grieved privately for grandchildren I'd never hold, for the chance to give unconditional love to little ones who might have loved me back without conditions or qualifications. "You should have thought of that before," David said that Tuesday morning, his voice cutting through memories that suddenly felt foolish and sentimental. "Before what?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "Before you decided to make your whole life about me," he said, standing up from my kitchen table, leaving his breakfast untouched like he'd left so many of my efforts untouched over the years. "Before you made me responsible for your happiness. Before you got old and expected me to take care of you the way you chose to take care of me." I set the coffee pot down with hands that had started shaking, though whether from anger or hurt, or simply the shock of hearing my love described as a burden, I couldn't tell. "David, I never asked you to take care of me. I just thought—" "You thought wrong?" He was moving around the kitchen now, gathering his things with the efficient motions of someone who'd been planning this conversation for a while. "I didn't ask to be born, Mom. I didn't ask for you to sacrifice everything for me. Those were your choices, and now you want me to feel guilty about them for the rest of my life." The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking in its completeness, but what hurt more was the calculation behind it, the way he'd clearly rehearsed these words to cause maximum damage. This wasn't a moment of anger or frustration. This was deliberate. "I never wanted you to feel guilty," I whispered, but he was already walking toward the front door, toward whatever life he'd decided I had no place in. "I just loved you." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob, and for a moment I thought he might turn around, might remember the woman who'd rocked him through fever dreams and celebrated every small victory, and believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. Instead, he spoke without looking back. "Love isn't enough anymore, Mom. It never was. You need to find somewhere else to live. I'm selling the house." The silence that followed his words felt like drowning in reverse. Instead of water filling my lungs, it was emptiness, a hollow space where my breath used to be. I stood there in my own kitchen, watching my son gather his keys and wallet with the same casual efficiency he'd used to leave a restaurant after a disappointing meal. "David, please," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "This is my house. I've lived here for 15 years. I bought it with money I saved from—" "Actually, Mom," he interrupted, not even bothering to look at me as he checked his phone again. "You might want to look at the paperwork more carefully. The deed has both our names on it, remember? You added me when I moved back in. For financial security, you said. Equal ownership means I have just as much right to sell as you do to stay." The memory hit me like cold water. 3 years ago, when David had come to me broken and defeated after his divorce, asking if he could stay just temporarily while he figured things out, I'd been so happy to have him home, so grateful for the chance to take care of him again, that when he'd suggested adding his name to the deed for legal protection and to help with taxes, I'd signed without question. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had tried to warn me then. "Grace, honey," she'd said over the fence while I was planting tomatoes that David would never eat, "maybe you should talk to a lawyer before you sign anything. These days you can't be too careful, even with family." But I'd brushed off her concern with the confidence of a mother who believed she knew her child better than anyone else could. David was going through a difficult time, I'd reasoned. He needed to feel secure, needed to know that he had a home base while he rebuilt his life. Adding his name to the deed was just paperwork, a gesture of trust between a mother and son who'd always been a team. How naive I'd been. How foolishly, dangerously naive. "You can't just sell my house," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how weak they sounded, how desperate. Where am I supposed to go? David shrugged, the same careless gesture he'd used as a teenager when I'd asked him about missing homework or broken curfews. That's not really my problem anymore. Maybe you should have thought about retirement planning instead of spending everything on me. Maybe you should have remarried instead of making me your whole world. Each word was carefully chosen to wound, delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to aim for maximum damage. This wasn't the heat-of-the-moment cruelty that people sometimes inflict when they're angry or scared. This was calculated, methodical destruction of everything I'd believed about our relationship. I could have remarried, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. Harold Winters asked me out for 2 years after your father left. I always said no because you needed me home. Harold Winters? David actually laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. Mom, Harold Winters was a bus driver with false teeth. You think turning down Harold Winters was some great sacrifice? You think I should be grateful that you didn't marry some old man because you were too busy living vicariously through my life? The contempt in his voice was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Harold had been a kind man, gentle and patient, who'd understood that I came as a package deal with a young boy who needed stability. He'd brought flowers every Friday for months, had helped with yard work without being asked, had treated David with the sort of easy affection that my son had never received from his biological father. I'd turned Harold down not because he wasn't good enough, but because every Friday night spent on a dinner date was a Friday night not helping David with homework. Every weekend Harold wanted to spend together was time I could be driving David to baseball practice or helping him with science fair projects. Every moment of potential happiness I might have found with a good man felt like betrayal of the child who'd already lost one parent. Harold was a good man, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. He would have been good to both of us. Would have, could have, should have, David said, checking his watch like I was making him late for something important. The point is, you made your choices, and now you want me to live with the consequences. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life taking care of someone who was too afraid to take care of herself. Too afraid. The words echoed in my head as I watched him head toward the door again. Was that really how he saw my devotion? As fear rather than love? As weakness rather than strength? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted my spiraling thoughts. Through the kitchen window, I could see a sleek black sedan that didn't belong to anyone in our neighborhood. David's face brightened with the first genuine expression I'd seen from him all morning. Perfect timing, he said, moving toward the front door with more energy than he'd shown in months. Mom, meet my real estate agent. The woman who walked through my front door was everything I wasn't. Young, polished, dressed in the kind of clothes that cost more than I used to make in a month. Her smile was bright and professional as she extended a manicured hand toward me, but her eyes were already cataloging my furniture, my decorations, my life, calculating how quickly it could all be cleared out. Mrs. Morrison, she said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who specialized in difficult transactions. I'm Ashley Chen from Premier Properties. David has told me so much about you. I doubted that was true, but I shook her hand anyway, feeling the contrast between her soft palms and my work-roughened skin. Behind her, David was practically bouncing on his feet, more animated than I'd seen him since his divorce was finalized. Ashley thinks we can get top dollar if we move quickly, he said, his enthusiasm for my displacement so obvious that even the real estate agent looked slightly uncomfortable. The market is really hot right now for houses in this neighborhood. David, Ashley said carefully, glancing between us with the trained intuition of someone who'd walked into family drama before. Maybe we should discuss the timeline privately first. There's no rush to— There's every rush, David interrupted, his good mood evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. I've already waited too long to get my life back on track. The sooner we sell, the sooner I can use my half of the equity to start over somewhere that actually has opportunities. My half of the equity. From the house I'd bought with money I'd saved dollar by dollar over decades of minimum wage work. From the house where I'd nursed him through childhood illnesses and celebrated his achievements and comforted him through every disappointment. From the house that was supposed to be my security in old age, my shelter when the world became too much to navigate alone. Mrs. Morrison, Ashley said gently, I understand this must be a difficult situation. If you need some time to make arrangements, to find another place. She's had 3 years to make arrangements, David said coldly. 3 years of living in my house, eating my food, depending on my support. It's time for both of us to grow up and move on. His house, his food, his support. The lies came so easily that I wondered if he'd convinced himself they were true. If somewhere in his mind he'd rewritten our history to make himself the generous son supporting his needy mother, rather than the grown man who'd been living off my social security checks while contributing nothing to household expenses. I looked at Ashley Chen's carefully neutral expression and realized she was seeing exactly what David wanted her to see: an elderly woman who'd overstayed her welcome, a burden that needed to be handled with professional efficiency. She had no way of knowing that the mortgage payments had been automatically deducted from my bank account for the past 3 years, that the groceries filling the refrigerator had been purchased with my money, that the utility bills and property taxes were all paid from my modest retirement income. "I think," Ashley said diplomatically, "it would be best if I came back another time when you've both had a chance to discuss this privately." "No need," David said firmly. "We're ready to move forward. Mom just needs a little time to accept reality." Reality. As if the reality of raising him alone, of sacrificing my own dreams for his future, of working until my body gave out to ensure he had opportunities I'd never had, was something I needed to accept rather than something he should honor. But as I stood there in my kitchen, watching my son discuss the sale of my home with a stranger while I was treated like an inconvenient detail to be managed, I realized that perhaps he was right about one thing. It was time for me to accept reality. The reality was that the child I'd loved more than my own life had grown into a man who saw that love as weakness, my sacrifices as foolishness, my devotion as something he was entitled to rather than grateful for. The reality was that I was standing in my own home, being evicted by my own son, while he counted the money he'd make from selling the security I'd worked decades to build. But there was another reality David didn't know about yet. And maybe it was time he learned that the mother he thought he knew so well had a few surprises left in her. The next few days passed in a blur of humiliation that felt like drowning in slow motion. David had given me 2 weeks to make arrangements, as if finding a place to live at 72 with a fixed income was as simple as booking a hotel room. He'd said it with the casual authority of someone discussing weekend plans, not the systematic destruction of his mother's life. I spent those first mornings calling apartment complexes from the classified ads, my voice growing smaller with each conversation. "Yes, I'm looking for a 1-bedroom apartment," I'd say, trying to sound confident and capable. "My budget is, well, it's limited. I'm on Social Security." The responses were always polite but final. Waiting lists, credit checks, first month, last month, and security deposit that together cost more than I received in 3 months of benefits. Background checks that required employment verification I couldn't provide. References from previous landlords when I'd been a homeowner for 15 years. "Mrs. Morrison," one particularly patient rental agent explained, "with your income level, you might qualify for subsidized housing, but the waiting list for senior housing in this area is typically 18 to 24 months. 18 to 24 months. David had given me 2 weeks. I sat at my kitchen table each morning, circling ads in the newspaper with increasing desperation, while David moved through the house like I'd already disappeared. He'd started bringing Ashley Chen by regularly, and they'd walk through my rooms discussing staging and market appeal, as if I were a piece of furniture they couldn't decide whether to keep or donate. "The kitchen could use updating," Ashley would say, examining the cabinets I'd painted myself when David was in high school. "But the bones are good. These older homes have character that buyers really respond to." Character. My life had become character, a selling point for someone else's future. During one of these inspections, I made the mistake of trying to participate in the conversation. "The garden out back produces wonderful tomatoes," I offered, hoping to sound helpful rather than pathetic. "I've been working on that soil for years. The new owners will love it." David looked at me with the kind of embarrassed irritation usually reserved for strangers who overshare in grocery store lines. "Mom, they're probably going to landscape the whole backyard. Nobody wants to deal with a vegetable garden." Ashley Chen smiled uncomfortably, caught between professional courtesy and the obvious tension between David and me. "Actually, garden spaces can be quite appealing to buyers," she said gently. "Many people appreciate mature landscaping." But David had already moved on, pointing out other features of the house as if I hadn't spoken at all. I stood there in my own kitchen, listening to him describe my home to a stranger while treating me like an interruption, and felt something inside me crack a little deeper. The worst part wasn't the dismissal. It was how natural it seemed to him, how easily he'd slipped into treating me like a burden rather than the woman who'd made his existence possible. When had I become invisible to my own son? When had my voice stopped mattering in conversations about my own life? I tried talking to Mrs. Patterson over the back fence, desperate for someone to witness what was happening, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind or overreacting to normal family dynamics. She was watering her roses when I approached, her weathered hands gentle with the flowers she'd been tending longer than I'd known her. "Helen," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended, "David is selling the house." She looked up from her roses, her expression shifting from neighborly pleasantness to sharp concern. Helen Patterson had raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. She recognized the tone of a woman in crisis. "Selling the house?" she repeated, setting down her watering can. "Grace, that's your house. You've been paying the mortgage for 15 years. He's on the deed now," I explained, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "He says he has the right to sell it. He says I need to find somewhere else to live." Helen's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a kind of sad recognition that suggested she'd seen this story before. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "I tried to warn you when you added his name to that deed. These days, children, they don't think the same way we did about family obligations." The validation should have felt comforting, but instead it made me feel even more foolish. How many people had seen this coming while I'd been blind to my own son's nature? How many warning signs had I ignored because I wanted to believe in the boy I'd raised rather than accept the man he'd become? "What am I going to do?" I asked, and immediately hated myself for the weakness in my voice, for becoming the kind of elderly woman who burdened her neighbors with problems they couldn't solve. "You could fight it," Helen said, but her tone suggested she didn't think I would. "Lawyer might say you have rights, given that you've been paying all the expenses. But lawyers cost money, and fighting family, well, that's a heartache that money can't fix." She was right, and we both knew it. Even if I could afford a lawyer, even if I could prove that I'd been supporting David rather than the other way around, what would I win? A legal victory over my own son? The right to live in a house with someone who'd made it clear he wanted me gone? That evening, I decided to try one more time to reach the son I thought I'd raised. I cooked his favorite meal, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans, the same dinner I'd made for his birthday every year since he was 8 years old. I set the table with my good plates, lit a candle, and waited for him to come home from whatever job interview or networking meeting had kept him busy all day. He walked in at 7:30, took one look at the dining room table, and sighed like I'd committed some kind of social error. "Mom, what is this?" "Dinner," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I thought maybe we could talk about arrangements, about finding a solution that works for both of us." He stood in the doorway for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options, whether to humor the old woman or simply crush her hopes sufficiently and move on with his evening. "Look," he said finally, sitting down but not bothering to put his napkin in his lap or show any of the table manners I'd spent years teaching him. "I appreciate the effort, but this isn't a negotiation. I've already contacted a moving company to help you pack. They'll be here Saturday morning." Saturday morning. 5 days away. "David, please," I said, setting down my fork with hands that had started shaking again. "I understand you want to start fresh, but surely we can work out some kind of timeline that gives me a chance to..." "To what?" he interrupted. "To drag this out for months while you guilt-trip me about how much you sacrificed? To make me feel responsible for choices you made decades ago? I'm done with that, Mom. I'm done carrying your emotional baggage." My emotional baggage. 38 years of loving him, supporting him, believing in him when no one else would, reduced to baggage he was tired of carrying. I looked across the table at this man I'd given my life to raise, searching his face for some trace of the boy who used to hug me so tight when I came home from work that I'd forget how tired I was. The boy who'd made me Mother's Day cards out of construction paper and told me I was the best mom in the world. The boy who'd cried in my arms when his father left and promised he'd never abandon me the way his father had. But that boy was gone, if he'd ever really existed at all. In his place sat a stranger wearing my son's face, Someone who could look at the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him and see nothing but an inconvenience to be managed. "I raised you better than this," I said quietly, not expecting an answer, not even sure I was speaking to him or to myself. "You raised me to be dependent," he shot back. "You raised me to think the world owed me something because you worked hard. You raised me to feel guilty every time I wanted something for myself instead of thinking about what you needed. That's not love, Mom. That's control." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Control? Every choice I'd made had been about giving him freedom, opportunities, a future unconstrained by the limitations that had shaped my own life. How could love be confused with control? How could sacrifice be seen as manipulation? "I never tried to control you," I whispered, but even as I said it, I wondered if there was some truth buried in his cruelty. Had I loved him too much? Had I made myself so essential to his life that he'd grown to resent the very devotion I'd thought was my greatest gift to him? "You controlled me by making yourself a martyr," he said, standing up from the table without having touched his food. "By making every conversation about what you'd given up for me. By making it impossible for me to live my own life without feeling guilty about yours." He left me sitting at my carefully set table, surrounded by the dinner I'd cooked with such hope, listening to his footsteps on the stairs as he went to his room. My room, really, since everything in this house belonged to me until he'd convinced me to sign it away. I sat there in the candlelight, looking at the meatloaf growing cold on his untouched plate, and finally understood what Mrs. Patterson had meant about heartache that money couldn't fix. This wasn't just about losing my house or facing homelessness at 72. This was about discovering that the person I'd loved most in the world saw that love as a weapon I'd used against him. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had made myself too important to his life, had loved him so completely that he'd never learned to love me back. Maybe my devotion had been selfish after all, a way of ensuring that I'd never be alone rather than a gift freely given. But sitting there in my empty dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a failed peace offering, I realized something else. Whether my love had been selfish or selfless, controlling or freeing, it had been real. And it had shaped me into someone who knew how to survive loss, how to endure disappointment, how to keep going when everything familiar disappeared. David thought he was discarding a weak old woman who'd never learned to take care of herself. But he'd forgotten something important about the mother who'd raised him. I'd been surviving impossible situations long before he was born, and I wasn't done surviving yet. The moving truck arrived exactly when David had promised it would, 8 o'clock Saturday morning, rumbling down our quiet street like a mechanical vulture come to pick clean the bones of my life. I watched from the bedroom window as 2 men in matching uniforms began unloading boxes and bubble wrap, their movements efficient and practiced. They'd done this before, helped families transition from one life to another, but I wondered if they'd ever helped a mother get evicted by her own son. David was already dressed and ready, standing in the driveway with a clipboard, and that focused expression he wore when handling business matters. He looked like any other adult child helping an elderly parent downsize, responsible and caring to anyone who didn't know the truth. The neighbors who glanced over from their morning routines would see a dutiful son managing his mother's transition to senior living, not a man systematically destroying the woman who'd given him everything. "Ma'am?" One of the movers, a kind-faced man with graying temples, knocked gently on my bedroom door. "We're here to help you pack. Your son said you're moving to a smaller place?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. David had told them I was downsizing by choice, moving to a retirement community where I'd be happier and more comfortable. Another lie so smoothly delivered that even I almost believed it for a moment. The mover, his name tag said Frank, looked around my bedroom with professional assessment. "Don't worry about a thing," he said gently. "We'll take good care of your belongings. Moving can be overwhelming, but we'll make it as easy as possible." His kindness was almost harder to bear than David's cruelty. This stranger was treating me with more compassion than my own son had shown in months, speaking to me like I was a person worthy of care and consideration rather than a problem to be solved. "I don't actually have anywhere to go yet," I said quietly, the admission falling from my lips before I could stop it. Frank paused in his inventory of my dresser, concern creasing his weathered face. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I don't have a new place yet," I repeated louder this time. "I'm still looking." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of us wanted to voice. Frank glanced toward the door, then back at me. clearly struggling with how to respond to information that complicated what should have been a straightforward job. Mrs. he began. Morrison, Grace Morrison. Mrs. Morrison, I think there might be some confusion. We can't move your belongings without a destination address. That's company policy. Where did your son tell us to deliver everything? I had no answer. David hadn't mentioned delivery addresses or storage units or any of the practical details that would normally accompany a move. He'd simply announced that the movers would come, as if the mere act of removing me from the house would somehow solve the problem of where I was supposed to exist afterward. Frank must have seen the truth in my expression, because his face softened with the kind of pity that made me want to disappear entirely. Let me go talk to your son, he said carefully. There must be some paperwork we're missing. Through the window, I watched Frank approach David in the driveway. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see David's body language shift from confident authority to defensive irritation. He gestured toward the house with sharp, frustrated movements, then pulled out his phone and turned away from Frank's increasingly concerned questions. When Frank returned to my room, his professional demeanor had been replaced by something much more human and much more troubled. Mrs. Morrison, he said gently, I'm afraid we can't proceed today. Your son says he hasn't finalized the arrangements for your new residence yet. We'll need to reschedule once you have a confirmed address. He paused, clearly weighing his words. Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've seen a lot of family situations. If you need resources, if you need help finding services for seniors in transition, I have some phone numbers I could share with you. Services for seniors in transition. A polite way of saying services for elderly people who'd been abandoned by their families. I took the business card he offered, my hands trembling as I read the names of organizations I'd never imagined needing. Senior Housing Assistance, Elder Crisis Services, Legal Aid for Seniors. After the movers left, the house felt different. Not quieter, but hollow, as if the very possibility of it being my home had been extracted along with their boxes and bubble wrap. David was on his phone in the living room, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone dealing with an unexpected complication in his carefully laid plans. No, I understand that, he was saying, pacing between the couch and the window. But there has to be emergency placement available. She's 72 years old, not a candidate for the street. Not a candidate for the street. As if homelessness were a position I might be unqualified for rather than a horror he was actively creating. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at Frank's business card and trying to understand how my life had arrived at this moment. 2 weeks ago, I'd been a woman with a home, however modest, and a relationship with my son, however complicated. Now I was someone who needed crisis services and emergency placement. Someone whose own child was calling strangers to figure out how to dispose of her. The phone rang while David was still arguing with whatever agency he'd called. Without thinking, I answered it, grateful for any interruption to the surreal nightmare my Saturday morning had become. Grace? Grace Morrison? The voice was familiar but unexpected, carrying an accent I hadn't heard in years. Yes, this is Grace. Grace, this is Elena Vasquez. I used to work with you at Riverside Hospital in housekeeping. Do you remember me? Elena. Of course I remembered her. She'd been my work partner for almost 15 years. A woman 5 years younger than me who'd immigrated from Guatemala and worked twice as hard as anyone else to support her 3 children. We'd cleaned rooms together, shared coffee during break times, covered each other's shifts when family emergencies arose. Elena, yes. How are you? How did you get my number? I'm good, Grace. I'm very good. I got your number from Maria in payroll. I hope that's okay. I heard through the hospital grapevine that you retired, and I've been meaning to call you for months. But Grace, I'm calling because I heard something else, something that worried me. My stomach dropped. What did you hear? My daughter works at Premier Properties. You know, the real estate company? She saw your house listed and recognized the address. Grace, are you really selling your house? Are you okay? I looked across the room at David, still pacing and arguing into his phone, treating my displacement like a logistical challenge rather than a human catastrophe. It's complicated, Elena. Complicated how? Grace, you loved that house. You worked so hard to buy it. You used to show me pictures of your garden, remember? You were so proud of those tomatoes. The memory of sharing garden photos during our lunch breaks hit me with unexpected force. Elena had always been genuinely interested in my small victories, celebrating when my tomatoes ripened, or when I'd finally saved enough to replace the living room carpet. She'd understood what those modest achievements meant to someone who'd spent decades living paycheck to paycheck. "I remember," I said, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "Grace, what's going on? And don't tell me it's nothing. I can hear it in your voice. Something's wrong." Before I could stop myself, the whole story came pouring out. David's sudden demand that I leave, the deed with both our names, the failed apartment searches, the morning's humiliation with the movers. All of it spilled from my lips like water from a broken dam. 15 years of friendship creating a safe space where I could finally tell someone the truth about what was happening to me. Elena listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and outrage that let me know she was truly hearing me. When I finished, the silence on the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Grace," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. "That boy should be ashamed of himself. After everything you did for him, after the way you raised him alone, this is how he treats you?" The validation felt like cool water on a burn. Someone who had known me during my working years, who had seen my devotion to David firsthand, understood the magnitude of his betrayal. "Elena, I don't know what to do. I don't have anywhere to go. I can't afford first month's rent and deposits, and David says I have to be out by tomorrow." "Tomorrow? Grace, you listen to me. You pack whatever you can fit in your car, and you come to my house. Right now. Today." "Elena, I can't impose." "You're not imposing anything. You think after 15 years of friendship, after all the times you covered for me when my kids were sick, after all the lunches you shared when I forgot mine, you think I'm going to let you sleep in your car because your ungrateful son has lost his mind?" Her fierce loyalty was overwhelming. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone defend me, to have another person respond to my crisis with immediate action rather than excuses or complications. "Besides," Elena continued, "I have something to tell you, something I should have told you years ago, but I was waiting for the right time. Grace, that time is now." "What do you mean?" "Pack your things and come to my house. We'll talk when you get here." "But Grace, that boy of yours has no idea who he's dealing with. You're stronger than you know, and you have more friends than you realize, and maybe, just maybe, you have more options than you think." As I hung up the phone, David was ending his own call with obvious frustration. He looked over at me with the expression of someone whose carefully organized plan had hit an unexpected snag. "Good news, Mom," he said, his tone suggesting the news was anything but good. "I found a temporary shelter that might have space. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing." A shelter. My son had found me a shelter. But as I sat there, holding Elena's phone number and remembering what real friendship felt like, I realized something that David hadn't counted on. I wasn't just a discarded mother with nowhere to go. I was a woman with a history, with relationships he knew nothing about, with connections forged through years of working alongside people who understood the value of loyalty and mutual support. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that wasn't despair. It wasn't hope yet. Hope was still too dangerous to trust, but it was possibility. And sometimes, possibility was enough to take the first step toward whatever came next. Elena's house sat on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood I'd driven through but never really noticed, the kind of modest area where working families had built comfortable lives through decades of steady employment and careful savings. Her front yard was immaculate, with flower boxes that spoke of someone who took pride in small details, who understood that beauty didn't require expensive landscaping, just attention and care. When she opened the door, Elena looked exactly as I remembered her, perhaps a little grayer, but with the same warm eyes and quick smile that had made our long hospital shifts bearable. She pulled me into a hug that smelled of vanilla and coffee, holding me just long enough to let me know that my presence was genuinely welcome rather than grudgingly tolerated. "Grace, mija," she said, stepping back to look at me with the frank assessment of someone who'd seen me at my best and worst over the years. "You look tired and too thin. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" The question was so similar to what Nurse Claire had asked in the hospital, but coming from Elena, it carried the weight of real friendship rather than professional concern. Before I could answer, she was already guiding me inside, taking my small suitcase and settling me onto a couch that was clearly the heart of a home where people actually lived and loved each other. "Sit," she commanded gently. "I'm making you some real food, not that processed garbage from the grocery store, and then we're going to talk." Her kitchen was warm and lived in, with photographs covering the refrigerator and herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill. The smell of something savory simmering on the stove reminded me of what home was supposed to feel like. Not just a place where you slept, but a space where someone cared whether you were hungry or tired or lonely. While Elena bustled around preparing plates, I found myself studying the photographs she'd displayed on every available surface. Her 3 children at various ages, graduation photos and wedding pictures and grandchildren I'd heard about but never met. A life fully lived, surrounded by people who clearly cherished the woman who'd raised them. "You did well," I said when she returned with a bowl of soup that looked like it had been simmering all day. "Your children? They're beautiful. And they obviously love you." Elena settled into the chair across from me, her own bowl untouched while she watched me eat with the satisfaction of someone who found joy in nourishing others. "They're good kids," she said simply. "But Grace? They're good because I raised them to understand that family means taking care of each other, not using each other." The pointed comment about using versus caring hung in the air between us. Elena had always been direct, never one to dance around difficult truths or pretend that politeness was more important than honesty. "Tell me about this secret you mentioned," I said, after several spoonfuls of soup had warmed me from the inside out. "What is it you should have told me years ago?" Elena's expression grew serious, and she reached across the small table to take my hand. Her fingers were rough from years of manual labor, but her touch was gentle, grounding me in the present moment instead of the anxious spiral of uncertainty that had become my constant companion. "Grace, do you remember Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the woman in the private room on the 6th floor, the one who stayed for 3 months while she recovered from her stroke?" I nodded slowly. Mrs. Whitfield had been one of our long-term patients, an elderly woman from one of the city's wealthiest families who'd suffered a major stroke and required extensive rehabilitation. She'd been in her late 80s then, sharp-minded despite her physical limitations, and had requested the same housekeeping staff throughout her stay. "She was always kind to us," I said, remembering how Mrs. Whitfield had insisted on learning our names, had asked about our families, had treated us like human beings rather than invisible service providers. She used to tip us at Christmas, remember? $20 each, which was more than some people made in a day back then. She did more than tip us, Grace. Much more. Elena's voice carried a weight that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere significant. Mrs. Whitfield had no children of her own, no family except some distant cousins who only visited when they wanted something. But she was very wealthy, and she was very observant. I set down my spoon, giving Elena my full attention. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't just a pleasant memory we were sharing. "She used to watch you work, Grace. Really watch you. She saw how carefully you cleaned her room, how gently you helped her when she needed assistance, how you always spoke to her like she mattered. But more than that, she heard you talking about David. She knew how hard you were working, how much you were sacrificing to put him through school." "Elena, what are you trying to tell me?" "Mrs. Whitfield died 8 years ago," Elena continued, her eyes never leaving mine. "She was 94. And she lived those last few years in a beautiful assisted living facility that cost more per month than we made in a year. But before she died, she did something that I promised her I wouldn't tell you about unless you really needed to know." My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't say why. "What did she do?" "She set up a trust fund, Grace, for you. She said it was payment for the dignity you gave her when everyone else, including her own family, treated her like a burden. She wanted you to have security in your old age, to have choices that she never had when she was young and dependent on other people's charity." The words hit me like cold water, shocking and impossible to immediately process. "A trust fund? Elena, that can't be real. People like Mrs. Whitfield don't set up trust funds for housekeeping staff. This one did." Elena reached into a kitchen drawer and pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. "She made me promise to tell you only if you ever really needed it, if you were ever facing a crisis that threatened your basic security. Grace, I think being made homeless by your own son qualifies as that kind of crisis." With hands that had started shaking again, I opened the envelope Elena handed me. Inside were official-looking documents with letterhead from a law firm I'd never heard of, papers that used language too formal and complex for me to immediately understand. But certain phrases jumped out at me with startling clarity. irrevocable trust, sole beneficiary, Grace Morrison, and a number that made me blink and look again to make sure I was reading correctly. Elena, I whispered, my voice barely audible. This can't be right. It's right, Mija. Mrs. Whitfield left you $150,000, managed by her lawyers and invested conservatively for the past 8 years. With interest, it's grown to almost $200,000 now. $200,000. The number was so far beyond my experience that it felt fictional, like something that happened to other people in movies or books, but never to women like me who'd spent their lives cleaning other people's messes and counting coins for groceries. But why didn't you tell me before? I asked, still staring at the documents as if they might disappear if I looked away. 8 years, Elena. 8 years I've been working until my body gave out, worrying about money, accepting David's help because I thought I had no choice. Because she was very specific about when you should know, Elena explained gently. Mrs. Whitfield was a smart woman who understood that money could change people, could create problems as easily as it solved them. She didn't want you to stop working if work gave your life meaning. She didn't want you to feel guilty about having something your son didn't. She wanted this to be available only if you truly needed it, if your basic dignity and security were at stake. I thought about David's assumption that I was helpless without him, his confidence that I had no options except to accept whatever scraps of charity he was willing to offer. He'd built his entire justification for discarding me on the belief that I was financially dependent, emotionally needy, incapable of surviving without his reluctant support. There's more, Elena said, pulling another set of papers from the envelope. Mrs. Whitfield also left instructions about the house you're losing. Grace, she researched property law before she died. She knew that adding someone to a deed the way you did creates specific legal vulnerabilities, but it also creates rights that most people don't know about. What kind of rights? The right to be compensated for your contributions to the property, the right to an accounting of who paid what expenses, the right to challenge a sale if it can be proven that one party was coerced or misled into agreeing to it. Elena's voice carried the satisfaction of someone delivering long-awaited justice. Grace, you've been paying the mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance on that house for 3 years while David contributed nothing. That creates what lawyers call equitable interest that goes beyond what's written on the deed. I stared at the legal documents, trying to process information that seemed to belong in someone else's life. You're saying I could fight the sale? I'm saying you could buy him out, Elena said with a smile that suggested she'd been looking forward to this moment for years. The house is worth about $240,000 according to the real estate listing. David owns half on paper, but you own much more than half in reality. With Mrs. Whitfield's trust fund and the legal leverage you have from paying all the expenses, you could force him to accept a settlement that leaves you with the house, and him with a check for far less than he's expecting. The possibility was so stunning that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Not just surviving David's betrayal, but turning it back on him. Not just finding somewhere to live, but keeping my home, the garden I'd tended, the rooms I'd painted, the space where I'd planned to spend my final years in peace. Elena, I said slowly, are you telling me that my son is about to find out his helpless old mother isn't quite as helpless as he thought? Mija, Elena said, her smile widening into something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. I'm telling you that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice after all. And sometimes the people who think they're so clever find out they're not as smart as they believed. For the first time in weeks, I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was still too fragile to trust completely, but something stronger and more dangerous. Something that felt like the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd been underestimated by someone who should have known better. David thought he'd discarded a burden. But he was about to discover he'd awakened something much more formidable than the grateful, self-sacrificing mother he thought he knew. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something much quieter and much more powerful. It was determination. The law office of Peterson, Mills and Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown building that spoke of old money and established success. I sat in the waiting area, wearing the one good dress I'd managed to pack, feeling simultaneously out of place and exactly where I belonged. The leather chairs were more expensive than any furniture I'd ever owned, but after 38 years of cleaning spaces like this, I understood their language of power and permanence. Elena had insisted on coming with me, taking a personal day from her current job at the medical center to provide moral support. She sat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand when she sensed my nervousness threatening to overwhelm my newfound resolve. "Remember," she whispered as we waited for my appointment, "Mrs. Whitfield chose you for a reason. She saw something in you that maybe you've forgotten about, but it's still there. That boy of yours has no idea what's coming." The lawyer Mrs. Whitfield had designated as trustee was a woman named Margaret Chen, no relation to David's real estate agent as it turned out, but the coincidence of names felt somehow significant. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from years of helping people navigate complex legal situations. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, rising from behind a desk that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year, "I've been managing Mrs. Whitfield's trust for 8 years, waiting for the day Elena would call and tell me you needed our help. I'm sorry it took a crisis to bring us together, but I'm glad that day has finally come." She gestured for us to sit in chairs positioned across from her desk, and I noticed immediately that she spoke to me directly rather than through Elena, treating me as the primary client rather than a confused elderly woman who needed others to speak for her. After weeks of being talked around and dismissed by my own son, this simple courtesy felt revolutionary. "I've reviewed the documents Elena provided regarding your current housing situation," Margaret continued, opening a thick file that apparently contained my entire legal future, "and I want to assure you that we have several options available. But before we discuss strategy, I need to understand exactly what outcome you're hoping to achieve." "I want my house back," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "I want my son to understand that his actions have consequences, and I want to make sure this never happens to me again." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Those are achievable goals, Mrs. Morrison, but I want you to understand that pursuing them will likely damage your relationship with David permanently. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. Are you prepared for that possibility?" I thought about the question seriously, considering whether there was any relationship left to damage. David had already made it clear that he saw me as a burden rather than a blessing, an obligation rather than a person worthy of love and respect. He'd systematically destroyed whatever bond we'd shared, replacing it with resentment and calculation. "Mrs. Chen," I said carefully, "I think my son already burned that bridge when he decided to make me homeless. I'm just finally ready to stop pretending it still exists." Over the next hour, Margaret laid out a legal strategy that was both elegant and devastating in its precision. The trust fund gave me immediate financial independence, but more importantly, it provided the resources to hire legal representation that David couldn't ignore or dismiss. The equitable interest argument Elena had mentioned was even stronger than I'd hoped. 3 years of mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs created a paper trail that clearly established my financial contribution to the property. "Your son made a critical error when he had you added to the deed," Margaret explained, pulling out documents that I recognized from the filing cabinet in my kitchen. "He was thinking about control, about ensuring he had legal authority over the property. But joint ownership creates joint responsibility, and the financial records show that he's failed to meet his obligations as co-owner." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we can force a partition sale, a legal proceeding that requires the property to be sold and the proceeds divided based on each party's actual contribution rather than their ownership percentage on paper. Given that you've paid 100% of the property-related expenses for 3 years, you'd be entitled to reimbursement of those costs, plus your proportional share of any profit." Margaret pulled out a calculator and began running numbers that made my head spin. Mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance premiums, maintenance costs, all meticulously tracked in the records I'd kept without ever realizing their legal significance. Based on these figures and the current market value Ashley Chen has established, a forced partition would likely result in you receiving approximately 75% of the sale proceeds, she concluded. That's roughly $180,000, which would be more than enough to purchase a comparable property outright. But as impressive as those numbers were, Margaret's next suggestion was even more satisfying. "However," she continued with a slight smile, "there's another option that might be more appealing. We could offer to buy out David's interest at fair market value based on his actual contribution. Since he's contributed nothing financially, his interest would be valued considerably lower than the 50% he's expecting." "How much lower?" Given the financial imbalance and his breach of co-owner responsibilities, we could justify offering him $30,000 to $40,000 for his complete surrender of any claim to the property. He could take it or face the costs and uncertainty of litigation that he can't afford and probably can't win. $30,000 to $40,000, a fraction of what David had been counting on, but still more money than he'd earned through his own efforts in years. Enough to give him the fresh start he claimed to want, but not enough to fund the lifestyle upgrade he'd been planning at my expense. "Mrs. Morrison," Margaret said, leaning forward slightly, "I want you to understand that this strategy isn't just about recovering your property. It's about establishing boundaries and demonstrating that actions have consequences. Your son has operated under the assumption that your love for him made you powerless to defend yourself. This would correct that misunderstanding." Elena had been quietly listening throughout the meeting, but now she spoke up with obvious satisfaction. "Grace, do you remember what Mrs. Whitfield used to say about people who mistake kindness for weakness?" I did remember. Mrs. Whitfield had been fond of saying that the world was full of people who confused gentleness with fragility, who assumed that someone's willingness to put others first meant they were incapable of putting themselves first when circumstances required it. She said they usually learned their mistake too late to avoid the consequences, I recalled. "Exactly," Elena said with a smile. "And Grace, I think David is about to get a very expensive education in that particular lesson." The next 3 days were spent in careful preparation. Margaret's firm moved with impressive efficiency, filing preliminary motions that would prevent David from proceeding with any sale until the legal questions surrounding our joint ownership were resolved. Within 24 hours, Ashley Chen had received official notice that the property was subject to pending litigation and could not be marketed until further notice. I imagined David's reaction when he received that phone call. The confusion and anger he must have felt when his carefully orchestrated plan suddenly hit a legal roadblock he hadn't anticipated. For someone who prided himself on being smart and strategic, the discovery that his helpless mother had outmaneuvered him must have been particularly galling. Elena let me stay in her guest room while the legal proceedings moved forward, creating a comfortable domestic routine that reminded me what it felt like to live with someone who actually enjoyed my company. We cooked together, shared morning coffee, and talked about everything except David and the legal case that was reshaping my future. But even during those peaceful interludes, I found myself changing in ways that went beyond the legal empowerment Margaret was providing. The knowledge that I had resources, that I had allies, that I had options beyond accepting whatever scraps others were willing to offer, was transforming how I moved through the world. I caught myself standing straighter when I walked through Elena's neighborhood. I spoke more confidently when I called to check on the progress of my case. I looked grocery store clerks in the eye and thanked them for their service, remembering what it felt like to be invisible and making sure other service workers felt seen. Most importantly, I stopped flinching every time my phone rang, stopped expecting each conversation to bring news of another disaster I was powerless to prevent. The constant state of vigilance that had characterized my life for months began to ease, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years, the security that came from knowing I could take care of myself. On Thursday afternoon, Margaret called with news that made Elena break into spontaneous applause. "David's attorney has requested a meeting," she reported with obvious satisfaction. "Apparently, they've reviewed our preliminary filings and realized that proceeding with their original plan would be inadvisable. They'd like to discuss a settlement." "What kind of settlement?" "They're proposing that David retain a 25% interest in the property in exchange for signing over management and occupancy rights to you. It's not quite what we were hoping for, but it's a significant improvement over his original position. It wasn't everything, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that I wasn't the powerless old woman he'd thought he could discard without consequences. Proof that love didn't have to mean accepting mistreatment, that kindness didn't require surrendering self-respect." "Mrs. Morrison," Margaret continued, "we have them on the defensive now. The question is how far you want to push this advantage. We could accept their offer and resolve this quickly, or we could press for complete surrender of his interest. The choice is yours." As I considered my options, I realized that the decision wasn't really about money or property, or even justice in the conventional sense. It was about who I wanted to be for the remainder of my life. Someone who accepted partial victories and compromised solutions, or someone who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach someone that their actions have consequences. I thought about Mrs. Whitfield, who'd seen something in me that I'd forgotten I possessed. I thought about Elena's fierce loyalty and Margaret's professional respect. I thought about all the women who'd been dismissed and discarded by people who should have cherished them. And I thought about David, who was about to learn that underestimating his mother had been the most expensive mistake of his life. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at Margaret's office, neutral territory where David couldn't control the narrative or dismiss me as easily as he had in my own kitchen. I arrived 30 minutes early, not from nervousness, but from a desire to center myself in the space where my future would be decided. Elena had offered to come, but this was something I needed to face alone. Not as a helpless mother seeking support, but as a woman who'd finally learned to value herself as much as she'd valued everyone else. Margaret's assistant brought me coffee in a china cup that probably cost more than David spent on groceries in a week, and I sipped it slowly while reviewing the documents that would reshape both our lives. The trust fund papers, the property records, the detailed accounting of every payment I'd made while David contributed nothing, all of it organized with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered in ways that emotions didn't. When David arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, accompanied by a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, I barely recognized my own son. The confident authority he'd displayed while evicting me had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic barely held in check. His hair was disheveled, his usually pristine clothes wrinkled, and his eyes carried the wild edge of someone who'd discovered that the world didn't work the way he'd believed it did. "Mom?" he said when he saw me sitting calmly in Margaret's office, and for a moment his voice cracked like it had when he was 12 years old and had broken something valuable through carelessness rather than malice. "What is this? What's going on?" I looked at him steadily. This man I'd raised from infancy, whose every need I'd anticipated and met for decades, who'd grown so accustomed to my unconditional support that he'd forgotten I was a person capable of making my own decisions. "Hello, David. I think you know what this is about." His lawyer, a tired-looking man named Stevens who clearly specialized in damage control rather than aggressive litigation, cleared his throat and opened a folder that contained significantly fewer documents than Margaret's comprehensive file. "Mrs. Morrison," Stevens began, his tone suggesting he'd rather be mediating a divorce than dealing with whatever family disaster had landed on his desk, "my client is hoping we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly and amicably. Perhaps there's been some confusion about the timeline for your transition to alternative housing arrangements." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested she was enjoying this more than professional decorum allowed her to express. "Mr. Stevens, I think you may be the one confused about the nature of this meeting. We're not here to discuss Mrs. Morrison's housing transition. We're here to discuss the illegal attempt to force the sale of property that your client has no legal authority to sell." "Now wait a minute," David interjected, some of his old arrogance returning as he leaned forward in his chair. "That house has both our names on the deed. I have every right to— You have the right to your proportional share based on your proportional contribution," Margaret interrupted smoothly, "which, according to 3 years of financial records, amounts to $0.00. You've contributed nothing to mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, or maintenance. In fact, Mrs. Morrison has been subsidizing your living expenses while you've been planning to profit from her investment." The silence that followed was thick with implications that even David couldn't ignore. I watched his face as he processed the fact that someone had been keeping detailed records of his financial irresponsibility, that his assumption of his mother's financial ignorance had been catastrophically wrong. That's not how joint ownership works," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The deed says 50-50. That means you're entitled to 50% of any profit after your debts to the other owner are satisfied," Margaret continued. "Mrs. Morrison has been carrying 100% of the property-related expenses for 36 months. At current interest rates, your debt to her totals approximately $47,000. The house is worth $240,000. 50% of that is $120,000, minus your debt of $47,000, leaves you with a net equity position of approximately $73,000. I watched David's face go through several expressions as he tried to process numbers that were significantly different from what he'd been expecting. 73,000 instead of 120,000. Still enough to start over, but not enough to fund the lifestyle upgrade he'd been planning. But that's, he started, then stopped as the full implications began to sink in. Legal and accurate, Margaret finished. However, Mrs. Morrison is prepared to be generous. She's willing to buy out your interest for $40,000, paid immediately upon your complete surrender of any claim to the property. Given your debt position and the costs of litigation you can't afford, I'd recommend you consider this offer seriously. $40,000. I watched my son's face as he realized that his plan to profit from discarding me had been reduced to a modest payout that would barely cover his immediate expenses. The comfortable future he'd envisioned, funded by selling my security out from under me, had evaporated into the harsh mathematics of actual legal responsibility. "This is ridiculous," David said, but his voice carried desperation rather than authority. "She's my mother. She worked because she wanted to, not because I forced her to. She paid those bills because that's what mothers do. You can't put a price tag on family obligation." The hypocrisy was so complete, so breathtaking in its audacity, that for a moment I couldn't speak. This was the same man who'd told me just weeks ago that love wasn't enough, that he didn't owe me anything because he hadn't asked to be born, that my sacrifices had been my choice, and therefore created no obligation on his part. "David," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way that seemed to surprise him, "you're absolutely right. You can't put a price tag on family obligation. But you apparently can put a price tag on family property, and you were perfectly willing to do exactly that when you thought you were the only one who'd profit from it." He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years, and what he saw obviously shook him. This wasn't the guilt-ridden, self-sacrificing mother he'd grown accustomed to manipulating. This wasn't the woman who apologized for existing and accepted whatever scraps of affection he was willing to offer. "Mom, this isn't you," he said, and there was genuine bewilderment in his voice. "This isn't how you handle things. You don't fight back like this." "You're right," I agreed. "The woman you knew didn't fight back. She didn't stand up for herself. She accepted being treated poorly because she thought that's what love required. But David, that woman was enabling you to become someone I don't recognize. Someone cruel and selfish and utterly without gratitude for the sacrifices others made on his behalf." Stevens was studying his client with the expression of a lawyer who'd realized his case was significantly weaker than he'd been led to believe. "David," he said carefully, "perhaps we should take a moment to discuss this privately." "No," David said sharply. "I want to understand what's happening here. Mom, where did you get the money for lawyers? Where did you get the idea that you could do this to me?" Margaret answered before I could. "Mrs. Morrison's financial resources are not your concern, David. What should concern you is that you attempted to defraud a 72-year-old woman out of her home and security, and you did it so carelessly that you left a paper trail documenting every aspect of your scheme." "Scheme?" David's voice rose. "What scheme? I'm trying to help both of us move forward with our lives. You're trying to steal from your mother," I said, and the words carried a finality that seemed to echo in the quiet office. "You convinced me to put your name on my deed by claiming you wanted to help with taxes and legal protection, then immediately started planning to sell my home without my consent. You stopped contributing to household expenses while allowing me to support you. You treated my love like a weakness you could exploit rather than a gift you should treasure. The truth hung in the air between us, impossible to deny or rationalize away." David looked around the room as if seeking some ally who might help him reframe this disaster as a misunderstanding rather than the calculated betrayal it clearly was. "Mrs. Morrison," Stevens said finally, "my client would like to make a counteroffer. He's willing to accept $60,000 for his interest in the property, and he'd like to include an arrangement where he could continue living in the house temporarily while he—" "No." The word came out of my mouth with such force that everyone in the room turned to look at me. No counteroffers, no temporary arrangements, no gradual transitions that allow him to continue taking advantage of my kindness. I stood up from my chair, feeling stronger and more certain than I had in years. "David, you made your choice when you decided I was a burden you needed to discard. You made your choice when you treated my love like a limitation rather than a blessing. You made your choice when you decided that your comfort mattered more than my security." "Mom, please." I'm not finished. My voice carried an authority I'd never heard from myself before. the voice of a woman who'd finally learned that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, it was necessary. You can take the $40,000 Margaret offered, or you can face a partition lawsuit that will cost you more than you can afford and leave you with even less than we're offering now. But either way, you're going to learn that actions have consequences, and treating people poorly costs more than you realized. David looked at his lawyer, who was already organizing his papers in a way that suggested this meeting was effectively over. I need time to think about this. You have until 5 o'clock today, Margaret said crisply. After that, our offer expires and we proceed with litigation. Choose wisely, David. This is likely the most generous offer you're going to receive. As David and Stevens filed out of the office, David paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might acknowledge what he'd done and express some regret for the pain he'd caused. Instead, he said, "I hope you're happy with yourself, Mom. I hope destroying your own son was worth whatever point you're trying to make." And in that moment, I realized that David still didn't understand. He still saw himself as the victim in this story, still believed that holding him accountable for his actions was somehow a greater sin than the actions themselves. But I also realized something else. I was happy with myself. For the first time in years, I was genuinely proud of the woman I was becoming, someone who valued herself enough to demand better treatment, someone strong enough to protect what she'd worked so hard to build. David was about to learn that love without respect was just enabling, and enabling without boundaries was just another form of cruelty. And I was finally ready to stop being cruel to both of us. David called at 4:30 that afternoon, just 30 minutes before Margaret's deadline expired. I was in Elena's kitchen, helping her prepare dinner while we waited for news that would determine the shape of my future. When my phone rang, Elena squeezed my shoulder and nodded toward the living room, giving me privacy for what we both knew would be our final conversation as mother and son, at least in any way that resembled our old relationship. "Mom?" David's voice was hollow, defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "I'll take the 40,000. I closed my eyes, feeling a complex mixture of relief and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. Relief that the legal battle was over, that I could return to my home and my garden and my life. Sadness that it had come to this, that the boy I'd loved so completely had grown into a man who could only learn respect through force, rather than recognizing it as something freely given and willingly returned. "All right," I said simply. "Margaret will have the papers ready tomorrow morning." "Mom, He paused, and for a moment I thought he might finally offer the apology I'd been hoping for, some acknowledgement that he'd treated me badly and understood why I'd been forced to defend myself. "I want you to know that this doesn't change anything. You're still choosing lawyers and money over your own son. When you're sitting alone in that house, remember that. Even in defeat, he couldn't resist one final attempt to make me the villain in his story. Even faced with the undeniable evidence of his own cruelty, he wanted me to feel guilty for refusing to accept mistreatment as the price of his love. But something had fundamentally changed in me during these weeks of crisis and transformation. His words, which once would have pierced my heart and made me question every decision I'd made, now bounced off me like rain on a well-built roof. "David," I said calmly, "I chose dignity. I chose self-respect. I chose to stop enabling someone I love to become someone I couldn't respect. If you see that as choosing money over family, then I think you've learned exactly the wrong lesson from all of this. Don't lecture me about lessons, Mom. You just destroyed your own family over a house." "No, sweetheart," I said, and despite everything, there was still tenderness in my voice when I used the old endearment. "You destroyed our family when you decided my love was a weakness you could exploit instead of a gift you should treasure. I just finally learned to protect myself from that destruction." He hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat in Elena's quiet living room, understanding that I'd probably heard my son's voice for the last time. The knowledge should have broken my heart, but instead I felt something like peace settling over me. Some relationships I realized were worth fighting for, and others were worth fighting against. The wisdom was learning to tell the difference. 3 weeks later, I stood in my own kitchen again, making coffee in my familiar routine while sunlight streamed through windows that belonged to me completely and forever. The legal transfer had been completed with the efficiency that substantial financial resources could provide. David had taken his check and disappeared, leaving no forwarding address and no indication of where he planned to rebuild his life with the money he'd extracted from mine. Margaret had handled the transaction with the same professional competence she'd shown throughout our legal battle, ensuring that every document was precisely worded to prevent any future claims on my property. But beyond the legal protection, she'd given me something equally valuable: the experience of being treated with respect by someone who understood that age and kindness didn't equate to weakness or stupidity. Elena had helped me move back into my house, bringing groceries and flowers and the kind of cheerful energy that transformed a legal victory into a genuine homecoming. We'd spent an afternoon rearranging furniture, not because anything needed to be changed, but because I wanted to mark the space as truly mine in ways it hadn't been, while David's resentment poisoned every room. The garden had suffered during my weeks away, but not as badly as I'd feared. The tomatoes I'd planted in early spring were heavy with fruit, and the herbs had grown wild in a way that suggested abundance rather than neglect. I spent my first morning home working in the soil, pulling weeds and harvesting vegetables, reconnecting with the earth that had always brought me peace. Mrs. Patterson came over with a casserole, and her characteristic directness about the neighborhood gossip my situation had generated. "Grace, honey," she said, settling into my kitchen chair with obvious satisfaction, "I have to tell you, watching you handle that boy of yours has been the most inspiring thing I've witnessed in 40 years of living on this street." "Inspiring might be too strong a word," I said, pouring coffee for both of us. "I just finally learned to stop accepting unacceptable behavior." "That's exactly why it's inspiring," Helen insisted. "Half the women my age are putting up with disrespect from their children because they think that's what good mothers do. Seeing you draw a line and enforce it, well, it's given a few of us ideas about our own situations." Over the following months, I discovered that Helen was right about my story inspiring others. Women from church, former coworkers, even strangers who'd heard about my legal victory through the community grapevine, began reaching out to share their own stories of being taken advantage of by family members who mistook love for license to behave badly. I became an unofficial advisor to women facing similar crises, listening to their stories and helping them understand their options. Margaret referred several clients to me, people who needed to hear from someone who'd successfully navigated the emotional complexity of setting boundaries with family members. Elena joked that I'd accidentally discovered my calling as a counselor for women who'd forgotten their own worth. But perhaps the most unexpected gift came 6 months after David's departure, when I received a phone call from a young woman named Sarah who introduced herself as David's ex-wife. She'd heard about our legal situation through mutual acquaintances and wanted to meet for coffee if I was willing. Sarah turned out to be a thoughtful, articulate woman in her early 30s who'd spent 5 years married to a man I barely recognized from her descriptions. The David she'd known had been controlling, manipulative, and expert at playing the victim whenever his behavior was challenged. She'd divorced him not because they'd grown apart, but because she'd finally realized that his problems with authority, responsibility, and reciprocal relationships weren't temporary challenges, but permanent character flaws. "Mrs. Morrison," she said during our second coffee meeting, "I want you to know that what you did, standing up to him, holding him accountable, it wasn't just about protecting yourself. It was about refusing to enable someone who'd learned to use people's love against them." "I loved him so much," I admitted, stirring my coffee unnecessarily to hide the tears that still came when I talked about the son I'd lost. I thought that was enough. "Love is never enough by itself," Sarah said gently. "I learned that the hard way, too. Love without boundaries becomes enabling. Kindness without respect becomes exploitation. You didn't fail him by fighting back. You failed him by not fighting back sooner." Her words helped me understand something I'd been struggling with for months. I hadn't destroyed my relationship with David by demanding fair treatment. I'd simply stopped participating in a relationship that had already been destroyed by his inability to see me as anything more than a resource to be exploited. As my 73rd birthday approached, the birthday that had started this entire crisis when I'd simply wanted to have dinner with my son, I realized how completely my life had changed. I was living alone by choice rather than circumstance, financially secure rather than dependent, surrounded by people who valued my friendship rather than my usefulness. Elena and I had developed a routine of Sunday dinners together, taking turns cooking meals that we enjoyed without worrying about pleasing ungrateful recipients. Margaret had become not just my lawyer, but a friend who understood the satisfaction of helping women reclaim their power. Helen Patterson and I worked together in our adjacent gardens, sharing vegetables and wisdom in equal measure. On my birthday, instead of the solitary dinner I'd faced the year before, I found myself surrounded by women who'd become the family I'd chosen rather than the family I'd been born into. We ate cake and shared stories, and celebrated not just my 73rd year, but the person I'd become during the most difficult period of my life. As the evening wound down and my friends prepared to leave, Elena pulled me aside with a conspiratorial smile. "Grace, I have one more gift for you," she said, handing me an envelope that looked official but somehow festive. Inside was a deed to a small property about an hour outside the city, a modest house on 2 acres that Mrs. Whitfield had apparently purchased years before her death and designated as an additional trust asset. According to the attached letter, she'd envisioned it as a retreat where I could escape whenever city life became overwhelming, a place where I could write or garden or simply exist without any obligations to anyone else. "She thought of everything," I said, studying the photographs of a charming cottage surrounded by mature trees and wild gardens. Even peace I didn't know I needed. "Mrs. Whitfield was a wise woman," Elena agreed. "She understood that women like you, women who spend their lives taking care of others, sometimes need to remember what it feels like to take care of themselves." That night, as I sat in my kitchen looking out at the garden where tomatoes grew heavy on the vine, I realized that I'd learned something important about the nature of love and justice. Sometimes the greatest kindness you can show someone is refusing to enable their worst impulses. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach someone that their actions have consequences. David was somewhere out there, hopefully learning to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. I didn't know if he'd ever understand why I'd been forced to fight back, but I hoped that someday he'd meet someone who wouldn't accept poor treatment as the price of loving him. As for me, I'd learned that it's never too late to remember your own worth, to demand better treatment, to choose dignity over peace. I'd learned that survival sometimes requires more courage than sacrifice, and that the greatest revenge against those who underestimate you is living well. The fluorescent lights of Parker's Market seemed like a lifetime ago. That woman who'd accepted a voice message ending her marriage while she scanned groceries for people who barely saw her as human. I was still Grace Morrison, still a woman who'd worked hard and loved deeply and made countless sacrifices for others. But now I was also a woman who understood that those sacrifices had value, that my love was a gift rather than an obligation, and that anyone lucky enough to receive it should treat it accordingly. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't revenge, it's simply refusing to accept injustice as normal. And sometimes the greatest love isn't holding on, but learning when to let go. I was finally free.